Hi, my name's Nick Denny. In this video we'll cover advanced authentication. First, I want to start with an example of a working authentication, and then we'll look at a simple example to show how it all works. So with advanced authentication, everything is run by workflows. And you can see we have various workflows here. The key ones are the sign in as a user 1 and 2 and the refresh token. So I'm going to try and sign in and get a new access token. So I'm going to use the first workflow. You can see here this is a more complex setup. We have to create a consent and sign it and get a JOT token and then call the authorized URL. But you could simply just have the authorized URL on its own for a more simple setup. The key thing to note here is the authorized URL is opened in the browser and not run by the agents, unlike normal API calls. So we run the workflow. This takes us to the OAuth sign-in page. This is the service I'm using. This is a test service, so instead of a user sign-in, it lets me pick some settings. So let me just pick the correct settings. And then this is equivalent of signing in and completing the OAuth flow, so this will redirect us back to the callback. See here, it's taken us back to the callback page, and it's using the URL fragment, and it's extracted the code ID token and state there. And now instead of running the wizard, we choose to run a workflow. We use step 2, and we choose an authentication setting and a token that we're using. And we press run. And you can see here the API calls have passed. This is also another more complex workflow because it also generates a JOT token on this side. And the key thing to see here is the variables at the end of the run include an access token and a refresh token. So if I go to our auth tokens and auth settings, look at the auth setting and look at the token we're using. You can see here the expiry time is in 29 minutes, and if I edit it, we have the access token set here and the other variables we passed in, including the refresh token. You can see here the headers are just using the access token as a variable. So in the API calls that use this, so if I go to the API calls, see here we're using the authentication setting and the token. And in the preview it just shows you the variable access token. The last thing to see that's working is a refresh token. So we have a refresh token workflow here, and note that it's not scheduled, it's not running all the time. This is set in the authentication settings, and we only run it when we need to, when the access token's expired. If I go to the workflow results, we'll see the other times we've called it. You can see here this is also 2 API calls in this workflow, but the key one is the refresh token here. And you can see here we call get an access token, get the refresh token, and they're exported as variables. and that's how we keep the access token up to date and valid to be used. Now let's look at a more simple example to show you how it all works. First, let's look at the auth settings we're using. You can see here we have a manual auth setup. If I view it, you see it's type auth manual setup. So when you set up a new one, just use the manual setup, and then everything is done in workflows. So let's look at the 3 workflows we have. We have an authorize workflow, a refresh token workflow, and a get token workflow. And in these examples, each just contain one API call. As you can see here, this only contains the get token API call. If I get to the API calls, first, let's look at the Authorize API call. This API call is used for signing in the browser. Note, we set it up as normal with the URL and with a GET request, and we pass in the parameters in the URL as expected: code, client ID, redirect URI, scope. We're using offline access, as this will give us a refresh token, and a state, and we're just using an ID. If your endpoint is protected with mutual TLS, you could select an auth setting here. Or if it was protected with basic auth, you could have a auth setting and token. The key thing you need to do to allow this to be opened in the browser instead of running in an agent is using the meta tag. As you can see in the meta section here, under tags, we've added APImetrics :browser. So that means that when we run it in a workflow, it opens in the browser instead of running as an agent. So this is a special tag to let you do that. Now let's look at the next step in the flow. So in OAuth, you redirect to the authorization URL, the user signs in, and then it gets redirected back. The next step is swapping a code that you get in the callback for a token. So this is the API call we need, the get token API. The get token API is a post, and you can see here with the URL encoded parameters, grant type, authorization code. We're using environment variables for the client ID and secret and the redirect URI, and then in the code we're using a runtime variable, code. This will get populated by our callback handler. The other thing to do with this API is in the conditions. We know that in the response body we'll get an access token, we'll get an expires in value, and a refresh token. So we save these as variables: access token, expires in, and refresh token. These get saved into our token so it can be used. Note the expires in means we know when the token will expire. Lastly, let's look at the refresh token workflow. Refresh token API is very similar to the last one, and here grant type is refresh token. We've got the client ID and secret and redirect URL and environment variables again, and the refresh token is a variable refresh token. As with before in the conditions, this is where we extract the variables. So the access token is the access token, expires in, so we know when the token expires, and the new refresh token. Some OAuth flows wouldn't give you a new refresh token. This depends on your OAuth setup, but if you have a rotating refresh token, you'll need to save a new one. So those are the 3 API calls, and as I said before, they're added to workflows. And then in your auth setup, you have the manual auth setup here. And if I edit it, you see it's a manual setup and refresh token workflows populated with the refresh token. So you need to set that value so we know which workflow to run if a token has expired. Looking at the token again, you can see here this is a standard authorization and bearer token, so we just update the headers, but you could add other headers here, you could add parameters. Key thing to note here in green is seeing whether the token has expired or not. By using the expires in header, and this is set to the number of seconds in the future that the token expires, that gets saved automatically so we know when the token expires. So to pull it all together, you need an authorize workflow, a get token workflow, and a refresh token workflow. If you run the authorize workflow, because the API is tagged with the special meta tag, it opens the browser. That takes you to the sign-in page. That redirects you to our callback page. And this is the key URL you need for the callback, /tokens/callback. That extracts the variables passed to it, and then you choose to run a workflow and run the get token workflow. Select the auth service you're using and the token you're using, and then click run workflow. That saves the access token and the other variables into your token, so you can use it in your API calls. Lastly, the auth service has the refresh token set, so it knows when to run the refresh. If I now go to a demo API that uses the token, this get user info, we can choose the manual auth setup we're using and the manual token. You can see the access token is a variable here, but if we save it and run the API call, you see we get a pass, and in the call we've used a real access token. This manual approach lets you completely edit what the API calls do when doing the authorization and getting the tokens, and this gives you a lot more flexibility if with a little more work. Thank you.